Okay. Hello, audience, wherever you may hail. I'm your host, John Bruni. Welcome to The Focus. Join us as we explore some of the world's most fascinating and essential contemporary developments, shedding a spot of light in a world filled with alternative fact darkness. In this episode, we are pleased to be joined by Professor Anna Sergi. Anna holds a PhD in sociology with specialization in criminology from the University of Essex, where she is currently a professor. She specializes in organized crime and comparative criminal justice, and more recently, drug importations through seaports. Today, we'll be speaking with her on her new book, Chasing the Mafia, Ndrangheta, Memories and Journeys, published by Bristol University Press in 2022. Anna, welcome to The Focus.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Anna, you were born in Calabria on the tip of the Italian boot. How important was it for you to tell the story of mafia organizations in Italy? Was your father, himself an acclaimed and respected journalist who covered the activities of the mafia, key to your own career path?
Absolutely, yes. I think I went through what many teenagers and young people went through, which is complete denial and detachment from where I was from. I ran away, literally, if you can consider moving out of Calabria at 18, running away as fast as I could. I didn't want anything to do with Calabria and Calabria history. It felt too overwhelming, too complicated, and certainly growing up with a father who was constantly reporting on mafias and violence didn't really help to keep me there. But then something changed, and it changed with studying. It changed with research and getting into academia and criminology more specifically. So one way or the other, I was still attracted to the topic. And I realized that I didn't like how other people were talking about Calabria. So I felt like some sense of pride, and I kind of felt like, if I don't like the way they speak about certain things, I should speak myself, which is probably a very arrogant thing to say. But, I made it my professional choice to start looking at where I was coming from in a more critical, with more critical eyes, essentially, because I could, because I was detached enough to do it.
Yeah. In what ways do the mafias of southern Italy carefully cultivate both fear and tradition, making them to outside observers indistinguishable from southern Italian culture?
Yeah, that's an important topic and one that I probably haven't stopped researching yet. So the Ndrangheta, the Calabrian Mafia, which is the one I studied, and obviously some things relate also to other mafias, but not all, is built on tradition, in the sense that they are from Calabria. So the Ndranghetists are men and sometimes women from Calabria themselves. They represent the most extreme version of our cultural milieu. So if, let's say, a regular average Calabrian person holds very dear a certain value, the mafia will hold that value even more dear and essentially build it up to its extreme. This is the idea of family, the idea of honor, the idea of the traditional values that many Southern cultures, not just Italian cultures, but many Southern cultures of Europe hold very dear. Mafias use those values, push them to an extreme, and essentially twist them in a way that becomes harmful. So the idea of family and blood, which is something that is extremely valuable for various different reasons, which we don't have time to go into this. But in the mafia version of family values, this means blood for blood. This means that family, above all, is what constitutes the right way to do things. And this is obviously not every Calabrian's feeling, and definitely not the way a regular Calabrian would handle things like, things that happen in a family, things that could break a family, like an adultery or I don't know, some generational issue, but the mafia does. So this is very difficult if you don't understand where mafias come from and how actually, and you make an effort to understand their behavioral let's say, patterns, it becomes extremely difficult to differentiate. And it becomes also very easy to think that their behavior is just a product of Calabrian or Southern cultures, which is absolutely not true.
Yeah.
So it is a product because they make it so. It's not a product because our culture is inferior or is somewhat different or discriminating against certain things.
Would you say that the mafias have successfully caricatured Southern Italian culture then?
Absolutely, yes. I think it's so I can give you an example of it because there's something that happened a few months ago. The police in Calabria raided, I don't know, it was like some property, and they found over 200 dormouse, the animal, the little animal.
Yeah.
Dormice in a freezer, essentially. So there were, you can imagine the surprise of having all these little animals frozen somewhere. And the reason for that is because apparently it's still a tradition for some Ndrangheta families to eat dormice during very important summits and very important dinners. Now, this is something that no Calabrian would do. I mean, if I look at this, I almost laugh. It's like, what the? So it's such an old kind of. So, and I inquired about this with my older relatives, and it's like, have you heard about this? Like, do you know where this is coming from? Did you ever have the feeling that dormouse meat was something that was considered, something that was considered so rich and so important to have it at a special dinner? And it was something that, maybe 100 years ago could have been like that, but it's not like that. No one would ever. I never seen this, and I've had some very interesting meat feast in Calabria. So it's that kind of, this kind of holding on to certain things that are supposed to be Calabrian and they aren't, is really making a mockery of our traditions and the way traditions evolve. So the one thing about the Ndrangheta, and not just the Ndrangheta, but many other mafia which feeds on culture, is that not only they make a mockery of culture, but they deny the very essence of culture, which is evolution. It feels like with the Ndrangheta, evolution is not there. Because they crystallize certain behaviors and they crystallize certain values and tradition in a way that it's just unrealistic. So, yeah, to answer your question, yes, they do.
Yeah. From your understanding of mafia organizations in southern Italy, what makes them special in comparison to other organized crime bodies around the world?
I think what makes them special, and special in the most neutral term, not in any glorifying meaning, is that they managed, mafias in general, not just the Ndrangheta, mafias managed to separate the organizational structure with the business structure. So many organized crime groups exist in view of their business. We often say, and we often study organized crime as a profit-oriented type of criminality, where once the crime group chooses, let's say, or consolidates a criminal market, whether it's drugs or human trafficking or arms trafficking, then their business structure adapts to the market. Then the Ndrangheta or even Cosa Nostra at the time, mafias in general, when they are successful, sometimes they aren't, they manage not to do this. They have their own organizational structure, which has its own evolution for certain different purposes, including the reach of consensus, the reach of social power, the reach of political power sometimes. And then they have their activities, their businesses, which is a different thing. So they have more than one organizational structure at the same time because they pursue different objectives. One objective could be getting elected as mayor in a small town, because that means you can keep the social prestige of the family, and this will give you some very small time advantages, but still necessary to keep the consensus and the control of the territory you need. But at the same time, some other people in the family of the wannabe mayor might be drug traffickers and living in Venezuela, doing their own thing under the same family brand name. So the Ndrangheta capacity of diversifying is probably one of the most successful example of mafias and the ability of mafia to camouflage themselves precisely because of this capacity to detach their organizational structure and their business structure, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's sort of like they cover themselves in the veneer of legitimacy.
Yeah, that's the end goal always.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
never just profit for the sake of profit. It's power to get profit, and then profit to get power, and eventually power is the ultimate gain.
Mm-hmm. So how cohesive are the mafias, Anna? Do families tend to fall out with each other as much as they cooperate, or do they operate with far more coherence? And if so, how?
I think this is an interesting question because it's one of the venues of research which I've started to look into more specifically since writing the book. It's one of the questions that I pose in the book. I look at the Ndrangheta families as some of them as dynasties, as families whose importance across generation is maintained by a certain type of vision of criminal and non-criminal businesses, but also is affected by familyness, is affected by the usual things that happen in families, ranging from birth to death to, someone marrying someone else who, the parents don't like, or an adultery, or any other type of things that can happen in any family. So they're still affected by that. And you can see how this familyness affects their evolution in many ways. So what happens when you are supposed to marry your daughter to your ally who lives in the next village, and then your daughter doesn't want to and escapes with someone else? How do you handle that? And these things created feuds. It created mafia wars across villages and across families. Now less so, but still it's something to remember, and because it can happen again. Similarly, what happens if your son or your daughter are gay? This is something that in 2022, in many, if not hopefully most Calabrian family would be okay. But in a mafia family, which is a very traditional version most of the time of a Calabrian family, this doesn't go down well. Because if you are a man and you are gay and you are supposed to lead a criminal clan, masculinity still scores quite high. So this creates some breaks, and this will mean most likely that if the family accepts the homosexuality of the guy, the business side of the story, or the let's say leadership of the family, will be passed on to someone else, which could be a cousin, who could be, a different type of lineage. So this again creates some confusion in the way this family works. More importantly, we are, and this is more important for law enforcement. Law enforcement in Italy has learned to know the Ndrangheta by family surnames, but family surnames in Calabria are a bit like clans in the historical sense of the term. So you can have 400 people with the same surname and more or less linked to one another, but not knowing one another. I mean, there are so many people in my family with my surname, which by the way is a mafia surname, that I've never heard of. I don't know who they are, because they are the daughter or the son of a cousin, of a second degree cousin of living in Australia. Who knows them? So, but the assumption that the surname rules above it all makes the mafia family appear as granitic, as if indeed there was some cohesion inside the family. One primary example of this is the current mafia trial, which is in Lamezia Terme, maxi trial of over 350 people on trial mostly against the Mancuso clan. The Mancuso clan is the primary example of that. If you are assumingly journalist or some commentators, even law enforcement, thinks of the mafia Mancuso clan as if they were one big happy family. There are 11 brothers, each of whom had several children who also have nephews and sons and daughters. There are so many of them, and most of them fight with one another all the time. as in practically kill each other. So saying that you are in the Mancuso family doesn't mean anything unless you understand which specific branch of the family you are with. But it's easier to just associate the surname with some illusion of coherence, which in practice, people who live in the village, who know who they are, will just laugh in your face and say, what are you talking about? I mean, that's just not the way they work. So it's a tough question because it asks us to think about organized crime with family lenses, but also with business lenses. And, you know, there are people who've done that, look at family businesses. So that's what I'm planning also to develop in the next few years, hopefully.
Wow, that's a very complicated equation. I mean, I don't envy you for your task, but really, in the end of the day, when you complete your work, do you think that we will have a better understanding, a more sort of holistic understanding of how things are stitched together in this sort of direct and indirect way? Because I mean, it would drive a private investigator or a police officer crazy trying to stitch all this. It
does drive me crazy. And I think there is something not to be forgotten here, that in this complexity, obviously, I can afford, or you can afford, if you are interested, to embrace the complexity, but law enforcement sometimes can't afford to embrace this complexity because they have to bring results, they have reduced resources, and as much as they would want to, they have to, you know, make choices. So I have the utmost respect for this. But with my work, what I try to bring is different ways to save those people who eventually get harmed by the lack of complexity embrace. So in a way, I'm more concerned, my job is not to catch the criminal. My job is to make sure that those who are not criminal and are still embedded in these societies and communities are protected, at the very least by knowledge. So that's my job. So my problem is not the way, how do we identify those in the Sergi clan who are mafiosi, but how do we identify those in the Sergi family who aren't? And how do we make sure that they are protected against discrimination and against, you know, unfair invasion of their privacy and their life by law enforcement? Because this happens all the time. It happens all the time. So I think that's probably the way, you know, I'm privileged in that sense. I can afford to do that. I think at the end of the story, what many of us academics, at least working in the field of mafia studies, the good ones at least, want to do is to make sure that we debunk some mythology around the mafia. Mafias are families and men and women, and they are subjected to the same problems that we go through all the time, with an extra layer of complication, of course, given by the illegitimacy of their businesses most of the time, and their illegitimacy of their means when they use violence and intimidation, but also that there are so many factors around mafias that make it possible for mafia families and mafia behaviors to survive and proliferate. And some of these are about luck. There's quite a sheer, you know, of luck, but at some other times is really about making sure that you make the right decision at the right time. So possibly I want to make sure with my research that I bring back a discourse on culture, a discourse on migration, a discourse on how to differentiate between eventually the good Calabrians and the bad Calabrians, because what I'm seeing is a lot of stigmatization, and I don't like that. 3 days ago, the Times, the British Times, titled a news, Mafia Hub employs 500 Cuban doctors. There is something about Calabrian region hiring Cuban doctors because we don't have enough doctors for some reason. But calling Calabria Mafia Hub is not just insulting, it's wrong. It's just wrong. And I think it's my duty as an academic to fight that, to fight those narratives. more than help law enforcement to catch criminals. So that's, if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. You know, I recall growing up as a half Italian, but from the north. And I tell you, I went to an English-speaking school here in Australia, and there was absolutely no differentiation between anyone from the north or the south. We were all mafia. You know, we were. Yes, there was no. So discrimination at that level, I can well understand, and I have had my own experiences.
Yeah, and this is not right. I mean,
it isn't,
because they are a qualified minority. They are a minority, a qualified one, but they are a minority. So why would we all pay for their sins in a way?
Well, exactly right. So, Anna, in your father's time reporting on mafia activity and also during your own studies into it, have either he or you had reason to fear for your safety?
So I've learned things about my father's managing of his own safety very later on. My father is a very old school kind of man and a very old school kind of journalist. He never wanted protection. He felt like being protected didn't allow him to do his job. But nevertheless, this didn't make his life easier or safer or ours. So I've learned later on in life that there was a time when I must have been 6 or 7 years old, so the early 90s, where he was sent away because a mafia boss had it against him for some of his reporting. So he was sent away to Milan for 4 months, leaving my mom and to take care of us, of us, me and my sister, and having like a car patrolling outside our house all the time. I didn't know that. I was only 6 or 7, so how could I have known that? I've only learned that later on. And then thankfully the mafia boss was killed in a mafia feud, so my father could come back home.
Right.
But I've only learned that a few years back. And similarly, my father was mayor of a town called Limbadi, which is where the Mancuso clan emerged and are from, and today are unfortunately gaining more and more power. It's a 3,000 people village. My father, for reasons that are still very unclear to me, loved that village. I genuinely dislike it, but hey, it's his hometown, so whatever. And he decided to, it was at the peak of his journalistic career, so he told me, he felt safe enough to expose himself because it would be very unwise of anyone to touch him at that time. He was extremely exposed as a journalist. So he became mayor of the town, and we had all sorts of issues, from bullets into our car to my father trying to build an amphitheater, and with money that the mafia had their eyes on. It was public funding that the mafia clan had their eyes on. So they didn't like the municipality to hijack, in their idea, their money to build an amphitheater. So they burned down the amphitheater twice.
Wow.
So now the amphitheater is still there, but very small scale considered the original plan. So we had more than one issue, also because it's very difficult to draw lines. My father went to school with some of the people that eventually became the bosses and the heads of this mafia clan. So it was very difficult to speak to them in between the familiarity that you gain by going to school together. So you know them, you know who they are, and then you have to remind yourself. That's what my father always told me. You have to remind yourself that the person you have in front of you is something else. You don't see it. It's not like they come with a mitra or with a gun in their hand. They come with very normal behavior, and they treat you as if you are still classmates, but you aren't, because you've been convicted for mafias and you've been killing people, and you are involved with drugs. So it's very difficult to remember whose place, whose person you have in front of you and where your place is. And it's probably that. As for me, thankfully, I have a very different job from my father. It's different time. And I don't think at this stage, especially in Calabria, there is so many people who speak and abuse their words on mafias that I'm really the least of their problems. I had some unwanted attention in Australia, for sure, only in Australia, which is peculiar. But it's also very obvious why. There is no one else in Australia who has the kind of profile that I have, not because I'm too good, but because I'm the only Calabrian scholar who looks at the Calabrian Mafia. That's as plain, as simple as that. My other colleagues who might have looked at the same topics are not Calabrian. They are not felt as they are betraying their culture, which is what I've been told, that I'm betraying my culture and I should mind what I say because that's not what a good Calabrian would do, which is a very typical mafia warning.
Anna, while reading your book, I came across a little incident that you spoke of when you were in Melbourne and someone was going to buy you a coffee. Can you explain for our audience what someone in the mafia buying you a coffee means? Because I think that is something that not even Hollywood has covered that one.
Yeah, I think I wasn't sure if I should mention that because it's a very, very peculiar thing. So in the south of Calabria, not even in the whole of Calabria, in the south, in the Aspromonte region, Reggio Calabria, Vibo, it's a sign of respect when you enter a bar, especially when you are in a place that you don't often go, when people will notice you, let's put it that way, not somewhere where you go every day. And you go there and you meet someone you know, and this someone might not have seen you for a while, or they might have just, be talking to you after a while, and all of a sudden you are taking your coffee or go to pay, which by the way could be coffee or anything else, a glass of wine or whatever you are consuming at the bar. And then you go and pay and you find your pay, it's been paid for.
Right.
And and you instantly know who paid for you, because the person who paid for you usually comes and say hi, and they usually come in and say, hey, I don't want to bother you, but it's good to see you, hope everything is fine at home, goodbye, and that's it. So you know that person paid for you, and it's a sign of respect, but it also puts you in a position of reciprocity. So you will reciprocate the next time you see them. And that's the way, that's a behavior that is innocuous. It's just a very normal thing to do. But as usual, as it always happens with mafias, this behavior is often pushed to extreme, twisted into becoming something else. So when there are occasions, very few, there were occasions in my past, which I can only recall through my father, where you are in a bar and someone pays your coffee and you can't identify who they are. That's not a good thing. If you can't identify who they are, that's not the way it's supposed to be. You should be able to identify. And if you ask the bartender or the cashier who paid, they will tell you. And that you might realize that someone that you have an opinion of, that, or someone who's been kind of like rumored to have been involved with, some shady businesses, including mafia, but maybe not sure. Clearly that person is not in prison, so because he's there to pay you the coffee. But it's those gray areas. And the problem with that is that, fine, it's just a coffee. It's usually, 5 euros, 3 euros, 2 euros. It doesn't matter. But it puts you in a position where let's call him the mafioso, just to be clearer. The mafioso tells you, look how nice I am, even if I don't like you and you're speaking against me and I know what's your idea of me, I'm a good person. I want to show you I'm a good person, and I will pay your coffee to show you that I'm a good person, and I'm okay with you saying whatever you're saying about me. And I expect you to do the same and recognize my gesture. So the reciprocity is expected. And this puts you in a very difficult position, because you don't want to give that reciprocity. And if you don't, then you look like you are entering into a conflictual zone. It's a very nuanced behavior. But I grew up with this anxiety that I didn't have to accept coffee or anything paid by anyone, essentially, that I didn't know specifically, which were a lot of people. But specifically for certain people, or for people who would use me as a child to get to my father and say, oh, I paid for you, tell your father that. And that was kind of a no, red flag. I can't do this. And these happen in a couple of occasions, and obviously you are a child, you don't know, it's not like you can impose yourself or anything, but it's not the end of the day. It's not the end of, it's not the most dramatic thing that can happen, but it's just the rules of behavior that you learn are about subtleties, something that is way beyond who is guilty, who is innocent, who is, is way beyond that. It's about living in the same space, small space, and trying to make sense of other people's behavior in a very, very shady and obscure relationship milieu, let's say.
Wow.
I probably confused you more than anything.
No, not at all, not at all. I'm just trying to get my head around all of these little subtle gestures and things. I would get into so much trouble. Oh, you're buying me a coffee. That's very generous. Thanks very much, mate. Well,
but that's fine. But that's fine, because actually, if you accept the coffee, if you, John Bruni, accept the coffee, that's not a problem, because it wouldn't be done with the same back thought, with the same afterthought. The afterthought is the problem. Their afterthought and your afterthought. So it's a complication. It's the same way in which some intimidation works with me, but it might not work with you. If someone tells you you are a cop lover, you would laugh it off and say, yeah, okay. But if that someone is the son of someone else that you know might be or might have been accused to be part of the Ndrangheta, and they are telling me this because they know I'm researching their file, then it becomes a whole other, the unsaid is a lot more problematic than the said. So it's all about, and that's really what mafia intimidation is, to exploit the recognition that you have of certain behaviors and certain cultural values and cultural traditions.
Okay, and staying within the sort of cultural milieu of things, how have journalistic interpretations and Hollywood imaginings of groups like Ndrangheta, Cosa Nostra romanticized organized crime? In a documentary I watched recently on putting together mafia movies and TV series, it's been said that directors often seek out the advice of retired hitmen or mafia associates to get to the truth of the matter. But do they get to the truth of the matter?
That's another story. So there is a wonderful branch of criminology that looks at narratives and the way in which narratives build the phenomenon. And I very much subscribe to this theoretical approach. Essentially, this means that if you want to know a phenomenon, you have to consider all narratives and assume that all narratives are true to a certain extent. The mafia man who turns into state witness and tells you the story the way he sees it, it's his own narrative. For him and for others like him, constitute the organization. There's no doubt about it. It's not like I can tell him, no, you're wrong. That's not what the mafia is. Of course, that's what the mafia is, because that's what he believes and that's what he says. So there is some truth to that. Similarly, the opposite is true. The victims of mafias who have their own narrative because they've been harmed and they've been affected by violence or intimidation or just fear, their narrative of mafias as omnipresent feeding beast, which can do anything they want to, the absoluteness of mafia narratives that victims have is also true. Law enforcement structures mafias in ways which sometimes look so naive and so detached from reality that you can't really believe that that's what they're doing with resources. The image of Cosa Nostra, that's the boss and that's the underboss and that's the conciliation. It's just ridiculous. And so, like, do you really believe that's how things in practice work? Maybe in theory, but in practice, the relationship among people are way more complicated than that. And have to do with charisma and have to do with opportunities and context and all of that. So the capacity and the ability and the necessity of law enforcement to pigeonhole things in a certain way is also the narrative that constitutes the mafia itself. It brings back into reality a certain view. So a successful mafia documentary will consider all of it together. Very few of them do. Definitely Hollywood doesn't do it. because Hollywood wants to appeal to the unknown, and the unknown in mafias is the secrecy. So mafias are still semi-secret societies, and I say semi because we do know some of it, some things about it, but they're still semi-secret. So the view of law enforcement or the view of victims are not even remotely as interesting as the view of the mobster who turns state witness. The view of victims is only worthwhile telling when it's full of emotion and pietas and tears and obviously drama. So I think that the problem is that dramatization of mafias has privileged the unveiling of the secrecy and assuming that the secrecy is somewhat special. Well, sometimes secrecy is just secrecy. So when you think of any family business in your family that you want to keep secret, it's not because you want to keep it secret because it's so special. Sometimes you keep it secret because you believe it's something personal, it's something private, it's something you don't want other people to know. It's not because you are so above everyone else. And that's the problem. Telling mafias as they are, as a bunch of I don't even know how to indulging people who believe that certain behavior is still acceptable in 2022, which, you know, is problematic to think, or even people who assume that making some oaths and some rituals is still cool in 2022, and in the name of those rituals, killing people or intimidating people is still cool. It's bringing it down to the reality of their farce is not selling any movie. It's much cooler to make people believe that the secrecy and getting behind the secrecy is the coolest part, or dramatizing the effects is the coolest part. And you know, I'm a very public academic. I speak to everyone. I speak to mob watchers as much as I can speak to journalists. And by the way, sometimes I prefer mob watchers to journalists for various reasons. But anyway, but in any case, I speak to everyone because I think I can bring my narrative, because I still have a narrative, and my narrative is not better than anyone else's narrative. So, but at the same time, you know, I think media have obey different rules. So I'm not sure how much of an impact we can always make. You know, now there are documentaries being made into the historical facts of the Ndrangheta in Australia or in Canada or wherever, and they always look for the gangster angle. They always look for the, you know, violent angle, or it's just.
It's the filter by which we try to simplify an otherwise very complex story. And that's really what it comes down to. We pick what we understand, what we can relate to, the thing that's sexy, the thing that's violent, the thing that will look good on the big screen. And that's what we actually stick with. And that stays in the public consciousness. So when we listen to, you know, news reports issued out by the media because of organized crime, we all automatically have a picture in our head what that's all about. It probably bears maybe at best 50% of the truth, but the rest of it's just buried because it's all too complex. Yeah,
but it's also very difficult to unpack and to actually bring it down, because I'm not offering a sexier version of it. I'm offering like it's as plain as it can be, and actually this is not cool at all. If you really think in 2022 that having a dote of the Ndrangheta, dote being a ranking and being attributed the role of, I don't know, Santista or Vangelo or Trequartino, if you really think that's cool, then you have a problem. I mean, there's no other way, honestly. So, yeah.
One moment.
Yes.
One moment. Something happened.
Yes.
To my sound system.
Okay.
That's very odd. Okay, say something now, please, Anna.
What can I say?
You're coming through. Hang on, what's going on here?
I didn't do anything, so.
I know, I think it's the Mafia. I think my my headphones must be cactus. So what we'll do is we'll just continue on. I think We're still recording, so
You are still.
my
Yes.
poor benighted colleague in New Zealand will have to cut his way through this one. But yeah, that was really odd. I've never actually had that happen to me, where I had this enormous kaboom sound, and then all of a sudden your sound dropped out of my earphones. So anyway, there you go. Oh, yeah.
Well, it is the mafia. They can do anything.
You know,
haven't you heard? They are all powerful and almighty.
They are, and they control the technology, as we know.
Yes,
anyway,
Anna,
in Australia, as you'll know from your own research experience in this country, we tend to see serious organized crime as a national security threat, whether the groups are of European, Asian, African, Middle Eastern, or American origin. How do Europeans view Italian organized crime groups?
Depends which European you ask. So Italians see organized crime in a very unique way, because obviously our history with the mafia and our representation of mafias has completely hijack any sense of proportion. So we see mafias as a public order issue, and as an issue that is heavily affecting our democracy, because it can impact elections, it can impact public order more generally. But that Italy is alone in this. It's the general, so you have different European states, and then you have the European Union above it all, which obviously creates another layer of stratification. And definitely, since the European Union consolidated its security agenda since 1993, since the Maastricht Treaty, we definitely have a consolidation of internal security matters and organized crime as an internal security matter, internal to the EU. So we have, unfortunately, very clear sense of national, well, of European boundaries. Fortress Europe is also Fortress Europe for organized crime. So in this sense, the European strategy as a EU strategy is a strategy where organized crime is considered an international security, national and international security threat, where most of it is based on trafficking that crosses border. And obviously the response, which sometimes is a helpful one, is about consolidating cross-border cooperation through Europol or Eurojust, and eventually helping states to do investigations and to have the investigations to have cross-border investigation hold in national courts. That's the problem. If I'm investigating a criminal group and this criminal group by car goes from Italy to Germany, I need to be able as an Italian prosecutor to follow them to Germany and use whatever surveillance and whatever interception I gather in Germany also in an Italian court. So that's a very practical problem, and that's where Europe is going at this stage. But the rest of the European states, organized crime is, again, a very national matter. And so you have Germany being very much now focused on Arab clans and whatever, which, by the way, are very similar to the Ndrangheta in many ways. And obviously, this brings about a newly harsh debate on ethnic organized crime, which never goes away. Same goes for the UK, even if the UK is not in the European Union anymore, but obviously still in Europe, where a lot of the organized crime debate is about ethnic, and they have it against the Albanians and the Western Balkans, because apparently that's their ethnicity of choice. But very little is done on the social drives of organized crime across many countries that I could see. A lot is done to counter organized crime activities, namely drugs and trafficking, humans or other type of commodities. Very little is done to understand violence of organized crime. 2 days ago, I think a few days ago, a 9-year-old child has been killed in Liverpool in the crossfire between criminal groups. 9-year-old. And Liverpool is not a new place for organized crime. It's a very, very old place for organized crime. But this tells you how much. But this doesn't feature under organized crime. It features under gun violence, which is a label. And it's difficult to, especially in the UK, to bring all the label together. It's like organized crime sits at this cross-border national security area, a bit like in Australia, but then the actual social impact of it doesn't feature. in the organized crime agenda. And this is not, this is something that many European states have in the same way as Australia has, because I think Australia has borrowed it from Europe one way or the other, or at least has consolidated it from the European side.
So tell me, Anna, in terms of how transnational organized crime operates in Italy, just in Italy alone, right? So we've got now, Mexican cartels that are highly sophisticated. We've got cartels from Venezuela. We've got the Chinese triads. We've got other organized crime groups from Eastern Europe. I mean, are they all having a piece of the action in Italy, or is it, or are the Ndrangheta and Cosa Nostra and all the other mafia groups, have they pooled their resources to push out the foreigners so they can dominate the criminal agenda, at least in Italy, if they can't do it broader in Europe?
Yeah, that's an under-researched area, but Italy is not immune from transnational criminal groups for various reasons. A, the fact that we have mafias also means that we have stable criminal markets, which also means that mafias have no intention most of the time to keep away foreigners. Just to give you an example, the Ndrangheta clans, which are mostly active in cocaine, have come to several partnerships with the Western Balkans groups in Italy as well, because it's convenient to both of them to do so, assuming that there is not a finished or a finite amount of cocaine, that there is an infinite amount of cocaine going around. It doesn't help to monopolize the market. It helps to bring more cocaine from more diversified routes. So if the Western Balkan groups can secure those diversified routes through the Balkans or any other country, and then Ndrangheta can get their slice of it by offering access to a port or to truck company or to whatever, then why not? The same goes with Cosa Nostra and some markets in which Cosa Nostra has never really engaged with, such as prostitution. Prostitution in Palermo is a matter for some Nigerian clans for various reasons that have to do with migration and and there is no indication that these Nigerian clans have to engage with Cosa Nostra to do so. There is some indication that Cosa Nostra lets them do whatever they want, and if they need to, they will take a cut on certain specific services, including the drug services, to the prostitution industry. So that's the case. The same goes for some Nigerian or West African clans, groups in the north of Italy, who might handle heroin or who might distribute cannabis. So I think there is in organized crime, not just in Italy, we often see a hierarchy of groups. It just happens to be the case that in Italy, the hierarchy is really, really strong because it has a reputation for decades, which is different mafia groups. But the same is true for Australia. The Australian Ndrangheta used to do what now maybe some newcomers do. They used to do the distribution of drugs, or they used to do the extortion. Now they don't. They climb the ladder of criminal careers. Now they sit back and relax and offer guarantee or invest or do whatever. And the newcomers are the ones who do the dirty jobs. So there's always this kind of exchange. So in Italy, we do have that with the difference with the Albanian groups, because the Albanian group are considered to be at the same level when it comes to cocaine. They are in many cases more connected of some Ndrangheta clans, not all. So it makes sense. If the Ndrangheta wants to keep a large piece of the cocaine trade in Europe, they have to consider the Albanians as partners.
Okay, well, Anna, how penetrated is the Italian body politic by mafia interests? Is Rome corrupted completely by organized criminal activity, or have there been significant movements made in Italy to reduce their influence?
So I wish, in a way, that all of our political problems were mafia's fault. They aren't. A lot of our, and sometimes it's actually, that's another problem, because sometimes, especially in Calabria or in the south, we blame the mafia for a lot that is not mafia's merit or fault. A lot is really about the lack of capable politicians. And we do see it now. Italy is going to elections very soon. And I was just reading the programs of the major political parties in Calabria and in Italy, and the word mafia doesn't even appear in the program. Wow. The countering of mafias or countering of corruption is not even there. So it's an interesting phenomenon to claim that we have such a big problem with the mafia, and then no political party makes it a point to actually, improve the mafia fight. So we had some extraordinary levels of penetration in politics by mafias. But again, this penetration in politics is not an infiltration. It doesn't happen while no one else is looking at the issue. It happens in plain sight. It happens by sometimes in plain sight with mayors who are blatantly connected to mafia families in small towns, sometimes with funding of certain businesses who are mafia owned, which all of a sudden become part of the funding for certain political activities. We have that all the time. Sometimes, and this is spoiler alert for my next book, which I'm writing with a co-author, an expert in corruption and political corruption in Italy. Sometimes they use different type of networks, including, and that's because Italy has a problem with it, Freemasonry. Or other type of para-Masonic links, which act as chambers of compensation, where the entrepreneur meets the lawyer, and the lawyer meets the accountant, and the accountant becomes the next politician. And therefore, friends will help friends, and brothers will help brothers when it's an official Masonic alliance. And Italy has an actual problem with it, not because we have a different type of Masonic lodges, but because the instrumentalization of Masonic circle is a very old and very rooted problem. So the infiltration of politics is a problem, not just with mafias, but with corruption before mafia in Italy. Where the state claims that they do, every government claims that they are doing something, but they, again, I think we don't have, the real problem in Italy is that politicians don't read. They just don't.
They don't read in Australia either.
Yeah, so in a way, I mean, we can say whatever we want, but they just don't read. And I'm not even saying about reading research. They, they don't even ask experts or anyone with some capacity of analysis. We had the last anti-mafia commission in Italy, which is a parliamentary commission, which has been established since the 60s to precisely study for the parliament and eventually the government, the mafia's evolution. They published a report on ports and organized crime a few weeks ago, which with data which was old, completely decontextualized. And if they just asked, not just me, but some other colleagues who is working on the same topic, they would have come up with a lot more, with a lot better, but they just don't. So the lack of expertise and the lack of willingness to learn is just, So we are basically just reacting and hoping the mafias don't kill people, because if they do, oh my God, what are we gonna do? So that's, I'm very pessimistic about Italian politics. So also because we are marching valiantly towards fascism again. So
it's interesting. I was speaking to a friend of mine today, and he raised this quote, and I'm going to totally destroy it, because at the moment I can't really think of the exact wording, but it goes something like that. For evil to thrive, good men have to do nothing. And I think that really sums up your position. There may be very good and noble and wonderful people in the body politic, but if they're prepared to do nothing, then evil will just keep on going. It's profitable,
and
right?
it's just and it's also in Italy there is another problem. Italy has activism against mafias and corruption and for legality is really high. So we have a fantastic body of civil society constantly doing very, very little and very, very much depending on capacities. It's just that that is constantly frustrated by political blindness, constantly. A state that is willing to invest on legality and anti-mafia would glorify those experiences of anti-mafia and anti-corruption activism. They don't. They make it harder and harder for NGOs and the civic society to build, their activities. It's just, so yeah. So it's really, yeah. And plus, there is no planning. That's the real problem. There is no strategic planning because no one stays in power more than 1 or 2 years.
Political problems all over the place. Anyway, I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast, and we're speaking with author and scholar professor of criminology at the University of Essex, Professor Anna Sergi. And from a public policy perspective, if we were to decriminalize certain activities that are the profitable domain of the mafias, such as drugs, sex work, and the like, would we be winning the war against them?
No, I don't think so. I am, unfortunately, I always think between pessimism and optimism when it comes to this. There is a very old saying, where there is a very important saying by Judge Giovanni Falcone, who is an Italian hero when it comes to mafias, because unfortunately he was blown up into pieces by Cosa Nostra in 1992 near Palermo. Yep. He used to say that the mafia is a human phenomenon, and like every human phenomenon, it has a beginning and it will have an end. All the time, this quote is taken to mean that we can win the fight against the mafia. But if you listen to the context in which Falcone actually said this quote, you learn that there are lots of phenomena that are centuries long. Yeah. There are lots of phenomena that are human, but that doesn't mean that they will end in a couple of decades. Human means that they are just in human nature. They will end, but that doesn't mean that they will not transform into something else. At the very core of organized crime, mafia type organized crime specifically, is greed and power hunger. Yeah. These are very, very human phenomena, greed and power hunger, which come with the way we build up our economy, the way we build up our society. And unless we undergo an overhaul of all this, which I don't see possible, we won't we might jail a bunch of mafiosi, we might bring down the whole of the 'Ndrangheta at some point, but I don't think the drives of this phenomena will just fade away, because the drives of these phenomena are human, and they are about greed, they are about prevarication, they are about, usurpation, they are about, assuming that for some people, some things are just a given and they want to get it as a given no matter what. So
and also, these organizations are so very deeply rooted and they're multi-generational. I mean, you just can't, a government just can't come in and launch a decree. Well, not unless they're Mussolini, but they can't really just move in and take these families out, because of the very, it's just impossible.
Because again, if we are run by the rule of law, which I still hope we are, you can't just assume guilt before you prove it.
Correct.
So that's another problem. So so we have some very disturbing claims made by some prosecutors in Italy and by some politicians in Italy involved in the anti-mafia realm that say, oh, well, if someone has a surname, then you have to, you jail them first and then you see. Well, that's not how the rule of law works. No. And it shouldn't. I mean, also because I would be the first one to go down. Yeah. So in Australia. So I don't want that. So, and also it's really not what that kind of message we should push through. So it's the balance needs to always consider the innocent first. So if you can't prove guilt, then you assume innocence. That's just the way we are ruled, and for good reasons, obviously.
Yeah. So I know we're running over time at the moment, but I've got two questions that I have to ask you. So I'm going to break all the rules here. So what did you gain from your research trips to Australia, the United States, and Canada? Can you tell us the differences in mafia organizations between these countries and those in Italy? I mean, do all roads lead back to Reggio Calabria or Palermo?
No, they don't. Right. And also the history has a major role here, history, political, social, and also criminal. Australia is one of a kind. I am absolutely in love with Australia. I adore you guys. And I'll be back in 2023 to start back again my research. But Australia is an island. And as an island, it has undergone, criminally speaking, a certain type of criminal crystallization when it comes to the mafia, and Ndrangheta specifically is the only country in the world where mafia of Italian origins means Ndrangheta and Ndrangheta alone. And this, so the popular idea of the mafia is the Ndrangheta. Whether or not people are aware of that, that's a different story. Not only the popular idea, but if phenomena are about the Ndrangheta. So everything in Australia is modeled around the Ndrangheta when it comes to fighting mafia-type organized crime or narrating it. And this is a peculiar thing. It's the purest form. So in Australia, I could really see the Ndrangheta 2.0. So what does the Ndrangheta become when it migrates in a certain period and sets up shop elsewhere? And then what does this setting us up shop means for the decades to come? So Australia is an interesting case for this reason. Canada is, wow, Canada is mind-blowing. The amount of complexity in Canada is just wow when it comes to mafias, because you have I went to Canada because of Australia, because some of the family groups that I was following, especially in Perth, had some ramification into Toronto, and I wanted to chase them down, as the title of the book says. But Canada has currently the Ndrangheta, old school Ndrangheta, so all the Ndranghetisti who went to Canada in the 60s, 70s, and they are Canadians. They set up Canadian families with the Ndrangheta flavors by keeping Ndrangheta connections. Then you have the newcomers who are trying to set up shop now in the rankings of this old style, which is in that sense very similar to Australia. But on top of that, you have old style Cosa Nostra, because obviously Cosa Nostra families are in Canada, and especially in the presence of Montreal and some of at the border area with Ontario, you have some very old, reputationally rich Italian-American mafia families of Sicilian extraction. And then you have new families which are trying to survive and exist. And they have a fake Italian origin, meaning fake, because these people have been American or Canadian for 3 generations now. Right. So they are not Italian. They just have a surname. So all of this together creates a lot of confusion, even for the criminals. So you have free riders, as I call them. So people who have a Calabrian surname, they've never been to Calabria, they don't know any Ndrangheta, they don't know who is who, but they read or they see that the Ndrangheta is a good brand, so they claim to be Ndranghetisti. They aren't, so create an enormous amount of confusion with everyone else. So I really sympathize, if I can say that, with the identity crisis of Canadian mobsters at this stage, because it's really difficult to understand who they are. And this also, to a certain extent, is true for the East Coast. I've only looked at the East Coast of the US, because obviously in the US, New York especially, the winning brand within Italian organized crime is Cosa Nostra. There is no doubt about it. Even the most powerful Ndrangheta family cannot change that. So what you see is Ndrangheta families entering Cosa Nostra, which always has been the case, collaborating from within, sometimes by double affiliation, sometimes by choosing one, but at the end of the day, making the most of everyone's networks and connections. So you have some Ndranghetisti or people that come from a Ndrangheta family in New York entering one of the 5 families or acting within the 5 families under the umbrella name of the 5 families, because that's the winning brand. And obviously, this also has to do with the way law enforcement sees organized crime. Canada is the first country in the world to have brought Ndrangheta trial to trial, successfully convicting Ndranghetisti because they are Ndranghetisti. It's the first country out of Italy. the US has a very powerful legislation against enterprise criminality. So whether it's Ndrangheta or Cosa Nostra, it doesn't really matter at the end of the day, because that's not the way they need to label things. But you can see in the way the FBI or NYPD think about the Ndrangheta that they still use categories belonging to Cosa Nostra. And this is really fun to see how they try to make it fit and it doesn't fit. And it's just, yeah, it's just anyway. So very different countries. And obviously I've done research a lot more on Australia than the other two. So I'm hoping that in the next future, I can do more research into other countries as well beyond now, beyond those.
Yeah. Now, and a last question, and we spoke earlier about the mafia groups and their relations with Freemasonry in Italy, but what about mafia groups and their relationship with the Vatican? Are there any?
Okay, we are getting, I think, okay, I've never researched this, but there are constantly claims about this, which could be either one of those options, conspiracy theories, which the same that goes around with the Freemasons might go around with the Vaticans. And also if you have touched Vatican's Freemasons and Mafia, you have an explosive, for the same reason we said before, semi-secret, still familiar, still sexy, At the same time, the proximity, obviously the geographical proximity of the Vatican to Italy, the fact that the Vatican is in Italy, and obviously the church as a way of hiding certain things doesn't help. Because obviously whenever you had some attempt to investigate this type of things or investments made in the name of the church, then everything was shut down for the separation of church and the state. So that's a different, so I can't answer that from a research perspective. The church, without the Vatican, the church itself had a very dubious approach with mafias, depending where they are. Sometimes you have priests who have been charged and convicted for mafia crimes. You have priests supporting mafia fugitives. You also have priests being killed for standing up against mafias. So you have it all. And so my lesson to this would be the context means everything. There's just no other way of saying it, which again, I refuse to think of mafias as a unique, united, coherent, formal organization all the time. The same I do for the church. Even if we call it the church in a singular term, I can't think of it in that way because otherwise I don't understand what I'm talking about.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. Okay, Anna, well, thank you for sharing your insights on the focus. And when you do come to Adelaide, drop in and Malcolm and I will buy you a coffee and we will hold the mouse. We will not have a mouse for you, so that's okay.
Great. I hope to be there in 2023 at some point. All
Fantastic.
right?
So okay, look forward to seeing you then.
Thank you.
Professor of Criminology from the University of Essex, Anna Sergi. Her book, Chasing the Mafia, I'm never going to get this right. I'm going to have to re-record this one.
Yes.
Yes, Memories and Journeys can be found at your local bookstore or your favorite online purveyor of the written word. If you want to know more about how the mafias really work, I encourage you to get hold of a copy. That's it for this episode. We hope that you enjoyed the show. My thanks to our guest, Anna Sergi, and producers Neil Smart and Malcolm Hughes. Thanks also to the Ozcast Network. You can find The Focus on the Sage International website at sageinternational.com.au, the Ozcast Network, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. So if you like what you've heard, please like and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, I'm John Bruni, and you've been listening to Sage International's The Focus.
Thank you, John.
Thank you very much for that, Anna.
All right. So let me know when it's out.
Yes, I will. We'll send